Welcome to this QNIS virtual event. We're delighted that you could be with us and we'll be starting shortly. We're just giving everyone a chance to join, so if you need to grab a hot drink before we start, then you have a minute or two to do that. You'll see our Twitter hashtag coming up on one of the slides, hashtag QNIS 2021, so please do tweet and share your responses to the event as we go through the session. So just as everyone's connecting, please feel free to say hi in the chat, let everyone know who you are and where you're connecting from. We have people joining on Zoom and on YouTube, and there are chat functions on both platforms, and we have members of the QNIS team working to collate your comments and your questions in the background. If you're on YouTube and you can't see the chat, you will need to sign in with an email if you're not already logged on. So welcome to those just joining. We'll be starting very shortly. We're just giving everyone time to connect on both our platforms, Zoom and YouTube. While you're waiting, you'll notice that we have two funding calls open just now for community nurses. Our Queen's Nurse Development Programme, which requires applicants to be nominated by their health board or employer. You can see some information there on the screen. And we also have our Catalysts for Change small grants programme, which launched yesterday. Community nurses working anywhere in Scotland can apply to us directly for up to £5,000 to take forward a project that will help address health inequalities. If you want to keep in touch with QNIS, please follow us on our social media or sign up for our newsletter, and you'll find the links in the chat as we go through. Recently, we've been exploring a range of ways that we can use to connect with others and also to flourish ourselves. And through the pandemic, one of the ways that we've been doing that is through poetry. And so for this conference, we've invited a poet to join each one of our sessions so that they can listen, write, and then share their thoughts with us at the end. So something to look forward to just right at the end of our session. And so I think that we are probably ready to begin this fourth session in our series of online events. I think we probably have most people joined and settled. Great. So a very warm welcome from the trustees and staff of QNIS. My name is Sarah Doyle. I'm the Deputy Nurse Director at QNIS, and I'm your host for this session. QNIS is a small charity, 132 years old, and our mission is to support community-based nurses and midwives as catalysts for change, making Scotland a fairer, kinder, and greener place to live. And that's really the focus of our sessions yesterday and today, an exploration of how we might make that a reality. We know things have been really tough over the last 18 months and the pressure continues. We hope these sessions offer a little bit of inspiration and energy, and that's why they're free, as our way of recognising the immense contribution that community nurses and midwives have made in our collective effort to stay safe and well and to support the people of Scotland through the pandemic. Whether you've been working from home, online from an office, or out and about in PPE, thank you. We've all contributed and we've all been under pressure, whatever the role you've taken on. Many of us have had to contend with our own ill health or that of our families. Many nurses have contracted COVID or needed to take time out to support their own mental health. We're very glad to have all of you with us this morning. So each of our sessions is a conversation between people who bring different perspectives to a theme. You'll hear a keynote speaker who will be followed by two keynote listeners who've been invited to respond, bringing their own experience to the narrative. And we'll then invite all three to open the conversation before asking you to share your own comments and questions to enrich the discussion. So our session today is titled Shining a Light on the Invisible, Relationships and the Emotional Impact of Care. And I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce our keynote speaker, Adam Burley. Adam is a consultant clinical psychologist, and he currently runs the Homeless Clinical Psychology and Psychotherapy Service in Lothian. Adam's also worked in New Zealand, where he set up a clinical psychology service in a rural district working with marginalised populations. So Adam, I'm very glad indeed that you're with us this morning, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to try and share my screen now quickly, so you don't have to look at me. You can look at something slightly more interesting. Can everybody see that? I don't suppose you have any way of telling me, but can someone say they can see it? Everyone can see it. Good. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit around, the title is excitingly Shining a Light on the Invisible. And I'm going to touch on, not in the order that it's written, I'm going to touch on relationships, a bit around adversity, and psychologically informed environments as a way of thinking about the impact that relationships can have on us, and that can have on care in general. I tend to work around populations who experience a high degree of exclusion of one type or another, and often actually from health services, often through ways in which they relate, not deliberately or on purpose, but by virtue of some of the relational experiences they've had in their history. So I'm going to start the talk's in chapters, but I don't want you to worry too much about that. They're very short and there's not many of them. But the first chapter is called The Invisible Breath, and I really want to introduce the idea of what a relationship is, or what I mean by relationships. I should probably say that caveat at the beginning. I'm going to say a lot of stuff today like it's true. None of it's true. It's just some ideas I've been having over the last 20 years or so. So the first bit is about relationships, and I think that's important because from my perspective, or certainly from this perspective, all healthcare is relational. Fundamentally, it is a relationship between two groups of people, some of which are called Bob and Sue, or patients, and some of which are called Alan or Adam, and they're doctors and nurses and various other people. But underneath all of that, there is a relationship between people. So here's the starting slide. I think if I wanted anybody to remember anything from today, it would be just this slide and nothing else. You can forget the rest. But here's Donald Winnicott, a psychoanalyst from the 50s, talking about relationships in his own idiosyncratic way, with one of his quotes that he's quite famous for. I say famous, very small f. Obviously, he's not that famous outside of psychoanalytic circles. But there's no such thing as a baby, which might come as a surprise to some of you who've either seen a baby or, in fact, have a baby. For those of you who haven't, it's the one on the right of the picture, although sometimes easily confused with the one on the left. So what's Winnicott talking about here? He says there's no such thing as a baby. Well, I guess those who've had babies or seen a baby will remember that when you get them home, they're almost entirely useless, really. They can't do very much for themselves. In fact, in the 1950s euphemistic language of Winnicott, he would say, if you leave a baby for too long on its own, it is no longer a going concern. And by that, I guess he means that it won't be physically alive or psychologically alive. That in fact, our physical and psychological life from the first moments of our existence is utterly dependent upon being in relation to other human beings, or, well, to something. And so in that regard, there's no such thing as a baby on its own. As soon as you talk about a baby, you are talking about someone else who is in relation to that baby, allowing it to live in the world psychologically and physiologically. So that's really what he's getting at, is that from the very earliest moments of our life, we are relational, external, and this continues throughout our life. So that's external relationships. So I'm going to nip through all of this, but there'll be plenty of time for chat and questions here. That's external relationships, which I think are more easier to think about. I wanted to introduce the idea, because it's important, about the idea of internal relationships. And I'd like to do this through the medium of Calvin and Hobbes, which, if you haven't read, you really should. It's a very important healthcare text. For those who haven't, Calvin's a little 6-year-old boy, and he has a pet tiger called Hobbes, who's not a real tiger. Is a stuffed tiger, but in Calvin's mind, he's very much alive. So in this cartoon, Calvin's waking up Hobbes and saying it's bedtime, and Hobbes says, "Well, I wouldn't have slept through that." And then Calvin sort of poses the question: "I wonder why we dream when we sleep. Do our brains just get bored? I wonder why we don't just plain sleep." And Hobbes says, "Well, I think we dream so we don't have to be so apart. We don't have to be apart so long. If we're in each other's dreams, we can play together all night. And Calvin's like, hey, yeah, sounds cool. So I'll see you in a few minutes, old buddy. And Hobbes says, I'll be there. And in the bottom left-hand panel, they are falling asleep. So they're moving out of consciousness into unconsciousness. They're becoming separate from each other in the alive world or in the conscious world. They're not aware of each other at that point. And in the final panel, they're asleep. But I guess the idea here is that Calvin has Hobbes in his mind and Hobbes has Calvin in his mind. And they are playing together in each other's minds. Although now there's 4 of them, because there's a game going on in Hobbes's mind between him and Calvin, and a game going on in Calvin's mind between him and Hobbes. And it's really to introduce the idea that our internal worlds are relational too, and they are constructed from the external relationships that we have throughout our life, that none of us choose our own minds. Our minds are constructed through the relationships that we have, for which we have no choice over. And I think that's relatively important to hold in mind. Certainly in my experience in healthcare, we often talk about people making choices, or that they chose to do this or that they chose to do that. Often when they're doing things that we find to be displeasing or uncomfortable in some way. It's sort of worth reminding ourselves that none of us chose our minds at all. And actually, when you really think about it, have very little choice over whether we change them or not. So really these first 2 slides are the key elements of relationships as the sort of fundamental bedrock of human existence, and by extension of health, mental health and well-being. To sort of turn the volume on that, I might sort of argue that relationships are the sort of psychological equivalent of breathing. Most of us have been breathing since we woke up this morning, clever us. In fact, most of us have been breathing since we were born, but we're so expert at it that we don't really notice it anymore. It's just something that churns along in the background. We don't get to the end of each day and go, another successful day of breathing. Well done me, because we're just so sort of good at it. But for those of you who've ever choked or seen somebody choking or had an asthma attack, you will know that breathing is the whole shooting match. It's everything. And if we're not breathing, nothing else matters. It's the absolute rate determining step of life. And relationships are like that for our psychological life, that most of us, if they're going well, we don't notice them. We've all been relating since we were born. And if everything is going fine, again, we don't get to the end of the day and say, you know, another successful day of negotiating emotionally and psychologically satisfying relationships, because we're just sort of doing it automatically if it's all going well. But again, a bit like with the breathing, if our relationships are choking all over the place, in fact, if all our relationships are choking, then the health consequences of that can be absolutely catastrophic and devastatingly life-limiting. Even though we don't see the relational substrate that sits underneath, we might see all the symptomatic sort of presentations of relational choking. So that's really what I mean by the sort of shining a light on the invisible, is this invisible relational platform upon which all human health and well-being sort of exists, really. That's chapter 1 over. Chapter 2 is a little bit about repetition, really, and about something about how this internal world can start to impact on our external world as we get older. Without being too boring about the theory behind it or the evidence behind it, most of us are having our minds constructed by the world in the first sort of 7 to 10 years of our life. And then after that, we start doing a lot more constructing of the world. So we start to see it through the blueprint that we've already developed internally in some way. And again, that can be all well and good if the first 7 to 10 years of our life have been straightforward and full of nice, healthy breathing and nice, healthy relationships. But if other things have happened, then we can be left with an internal world that starts to see the external world in quite sort of different ways. I suppose the obvious versions of that are all the myriad ways in which children can suffer adversity within relationships, within care relationships. And again, it's worth right at the beginning to sort of to remind ourselves that when we work in healthcare, these are some of the most primitive and anxiety-filled relationships going, because they are the first relationship that we ever enter. And we set up the health service with an idea that everybody can just come along and access care free from anxiety. But if your earliest experiences of care have been run through with pain, anxiety, mistreatment, abuse, and you have an internal world populated by such relationships, then even if it says hospital or clinic or care on the outside of the building, that might be seen very differently from someone whose experience of care has been at best anxiety provoking and at worst absolutely horrific, really. And that's the bit I think we miss sometimes. I think there's this almost institutionally autistic idea in healthcare. I mean, healthcare services typically, I guess, were designed by relatively healthy people. And so we designed them around our own image in a sort of sense of, well, if I needed care, I would go along and ask for help, and I would take the help and digest it and make use of it. And most of our healthcare services are designed in that sort of way, a bit blind to the idea that for some, for very good reason and through no fault of their own, there is significant, extremely significant anxieties about the business of asking for help. Experiences such as that can lead to people having a great degree of ambivalence, both internally and externally. And by ambivalence, I mean to really be in two minds, to have a part of them that might be seeking help and be desperately in need of help, but another part that's had to develop in response to early experiences to make sure that no attachment and no intimacy and no connection ever happens, because that's the place where harm and pain occurred. And so you might have someone with a horribly conflicted internal world where there's a constant sort of battle going on between a bit of them that's seeking help and a bit that is attacking themselves for ever having such a crazy idea as to seek help again. And that, I think, at times can be very, very difficult for those trying to provide help as well, where we are invited in to take care of somebody or pay attention to them only minutes later or hours later or sometimes seconds later, being told to get away and piss off because everything we do is rubbish and we're useless and no one's ever done anything for me. Only then the next day for the person to call again and say, I really need an appointment, I need to see somebody, something needs to be done. And to be in that sort of ambivalent care relationship can be very challenging emotionally and psychologically for those trying to provide care, because most of us didn't get into healthcare to be made to feel useless. So the person who occasionally defeats us can leave us feeling, well, defeated, I guess. Here's Winnicott again. Again, just to introduce the idea of sometimes the way people present doesn't necessarily on the surface give you a full idea of what might be going on underneath. Here's another of his, again with a small f, famous quotes. When a young person is to be found running down the street smashing windows, he's looking for his mother. That's quite a hard sell down the High Court, but it may actually have some truth in it, in terms of if a child has been unable to find something stable and containing and caring and reliable and trustworthy within the family setting, they may, in Winnicott's language, through a desire and a hope, go outside to try and find somebody to respond and relate to them, but may do so in ways that mirror the experiences they've had that led them to go outside in the first place. And typically then what happens is when somebody expresses their distress in distressing ways, it doesn't tend to evoke a huge amount of sympathy. So when somebody is smashing windows or smashing you or smashing up the clinic, it's not our first response to think, poor child, they look really lost and distressed and anxious, because usually we're feeling the anxiety in some way that they are not, because they're getting rid of it through the business of smashing windows in some way. So often people express early trauma and early adversity in very traumatic and adverse ways, and we can get to feel that as carers. We can get to feel something of the adversity, of the neglect, of the abuse in the relationship with the person who's bringing that history in terms of their internal world and the ways in which they relate to us as carers. And that can be difficult. It can be difficult for both sides, because when it follows a full circle, we can find ourselves enacting things out that that may have even brought the person to seek help in the first place. And I'll come on to that in a minute, really. This is, Hinshelwood is another psychoanalyst, and he was very interested in the health service and how it worked. And in this quote, he's talking about a group of people who attract the diagnosis of personality disorder, which is always an interesting term, and I guess tells you something about relational dynamics, because you can bet your ass it's a term that wasn't made up by patients. It was probably a term, well, in fact, it was a term made up by a group of people who were trying to treat another group of people. And it might even tell us something about how they ended up feeling about trying to provide that treatment. And Hinshaw sort of trying to capture what it might be, that there might be something characteristic about a group of people who have experienced a lot of early adversity within care relationships, and that their relationships with carers going forward are characteristic, and they're characterized at times by the defeat of help, and that we can end up feeling defeated. The picture is, for those who haven't seen it, this is the Joker from one of the Batman films, and here he is blowing up the hospital. And at times as carers we can feel a bit blown up, really, and we can find that hard. But these are very important relationships, very significant relationships. This is not benign. To get into a relationship with a hospital to the point where you find it important to blow it up is telling you something very, very important about how that person feels, or at least how part of that person feels about care and being in need of care. This can, as I say, I mentioned it earlier, but these difficulties can become compounded when, as a healthcare service or as care providers, very, very understandably, and there's really no criticism here at all, that we take part, sometimes in subtle ways by inventing terms like personality disorder, and sometimes in more concrete ways by discharging people and barring them and excluding them. We end up reenacting the very problem that brought the person to seek help in the first place. A simple version of that would be that the person comes seeking help, is asked to come along to the trauma clinic. By virtue of their anxieties about going to a strange building, to meet a strange person, to go into a strange room and have the door shut behind them, they don't turn up to those appointments, and they miss 3 appointments, and then they're discharged. And then they can say, you see, that's why you never trust anybody. Nobody cares for you, nobody sticks with you, you're always on your own. And we move on to the next person. But actually it can have an impact on us too, because as I say, most of us didn't get into this line of work because we want to discharge people or exclude people or not care for people. And so when we're invited into relationships that reenact the very trauma that brought someone looking for help, that can have an impact on us too, that we can become the excluding person, we can become the barring person, we can become, at times even a small a, the abusive person, and that is often not a pleasant experience for us and someone. As I say, I put this up, people will remember the baby P case, I guess, just as an extreme example, but in some ways a very ordinary, mundane example of how extremely distressing behavior doesn't tend to evoke sympathy. That when people behave and relate in ways that are distressing, traumatic, abusive, neglectful, and adverse in any other way, it sometimes kills off concern. In fact, attacks on care can really have an impact on carers as well. We can feel blamed, we can feel abused, we can feel neglected, we can feel mistreated. And one of the ways to get rid of them, some of those feelings, is to get rid and get out of the relationship of the person who is making us feel that way. Even if, as is the case in the areas I've worked in, they may be the people who are in greatest need of help by virtue of having some of the worst experiences going. Okay, so I was going to talk a little bit about, sorry, I know that's very rushed. I'm not sure I've explained it that well, but we can come back to it. The next chapter is really about a way of trying to think about some of these relationships that go on in care settings. So here's a picture of a boy on a surfboard. I don't know who it is. It's no child of mine, at least not that I know of. But it's my son did go for a surf lesson in Dunbar not that long ago, and I took him along, dropped him there, and he went off with the surf instructor, and they went off and had a surf lesson. I walked down the beach for a bit, and then I came back to pick him up an hour later, and we drove back to Haddington, and I was asking him what the surf lesson was like, and he was chatting away. He was like, oh, it's good, we did this, we went to thing, and all he spoke about was content. So he said, you know, we went to the beach, and we had to get our clothes off and get the wetsuit on, and there was some sand in it, and then the water went in, and it was cold, and we went out and stood on the board, and the waves and doing a noise, blah, 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 fell into the sea. But at the end of the time, and then at the end, I managed to stand up and surfing on a wave, and it was great. But what he didn't say was anything about the relational underpinning of that surf lesson. So what he didn't say was, well, you dropped me in the car park, and because of the relational history I've had with you and with Mum and various other people, I was able to trust this person who I'd never met before when he said, come down to the beach with me. And then further on, when he sort of said, take off your clothes and put on this wetsuit, I didn't bat an eyelid because of the experiences I've had up until this point. And then when we were in the sea and he was giving me instruction, I was able to listen to those instructions, digest them and follow them. I was able to trust him based on the relational experiences that I've had up until the point where you dropped me in the car park. And because of that trust and because of those relational experiences, I was able to learn to surf. Like, he didn't say any of that at all, didn't even mention it. But that was the only reason he learned anything that day, was because of the relational capital that was in his mind prior to meeting this completely new person who he'd never met before. And like the healthcare services, surfing lessons tend to be built on the sort of implicit but rarely articulated notion that if you're coming for a surf lesson, you need to be able to trust people who you haven't met before. And there's a sort of assumption there that everybody can do this because it's just a sort of invisible process like breathing. But of course, not everybody can do it. In fact, for those who have experienced, you know, adversity through their early care relationship, it's really one of the most fundamental things that they can't do. And often in healthcare services, we ask people to do things that we should know that they can't, in terms of like turning up to clinics at certain times. Funnily enough, interestingly, in physical trauma, we don't do this. Like when we arrive at the scene of a road traffic accident, we don't tend to say to the person with multiple fractures, right, you need to get up and walk to the clinic to get that sorted out. We don't ask them to do things that the trauma has made it very difficult, if not impossible, for them to do. And yet, certainly in a range of health services, we are often asking people to do things relationally that the experiences and traumas that they've had make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for them to do. And worse than that, when they don't do them, we tend to blame them for it. We tend to say that they're not turning up or they're not engaging or something like that. Here's a doctor, you tell he's a real doctor because he's got a stethoscope on. And I suppose I just put that on one to sort of say, to remind me to sort of talk about, again, I know I mentioned at the beginning, that all healthcare is relational. And unless we pay attention to some of those relational dynamics that underpin the healthcare relationship, then it can have profound impact on care for both of us. So for example, in this picture, the doctor seems to have fallen into the trap of being the slightly overbearing parent. And he's pointing at the man saying, what you need to do is smoke less, eat more vegetables, and do more exercise. And that might be fine for the person, and it may not even be detrimental to the care relationship. But he may have been invited into that sort of parental dynamic, slightly overbearing dynamic, because the patient had a very overbearing father and has brought some of that into the room with him, and we haven't noticed it, but it's being played out within the interaction. And this is a relatively benign one, but when traumatic, abusive, neglectful, mistreating sort of dynamics are brought into the consultation, as I say, they can have a very, very, very profound impact on care for both parties, for the person trying to provide care, for us and how we can end up feeling, and for the patient and how they can end up feeling when the relationship chokes. I've got a few minutes left, so I'm just going to run through this very quickly. I'm going to miss a couple of slides, but this is a way to introduce the idea of there's the light, never goes there. It's just to sort of say there is something we might be able to do about this if we can shine a light on some of these invisible relational processes. And they can come under the sort of broad description of psychologically informed environments, of which this is a simple but I think pretty effective illustration of one. So for those who haven't seen one of these before, it's a baby. You might remember it from slide 2, although I think this is a different one. But I wasn't meaning the baby. The thing that the baby's lying in is, well, in our house it was called the mind gym, because we're middle class in that way. I think it might have even said it on the side of the box. But what it is, it's an environment that is informed by the psychological and emotional needs of the person for which the environment is being provided. So it turns out, for example, that babies are really into black and white, and they're really into faces as well. And so suddenly pandas, having gone from the sort of toy wilderness, became center stage in toy stores around the world, because it turns out babies love faces and they love black and white. And so pandas are like catnip for babies. And then we've got little black and white stripes up here on the star. There's another panda down here, two pandas, and a penguin. They're quite black and whitey. And the star. And there's a little bird over here with a black and white stomach. I don't think that bird occurs in nature, but here it is in the psychologically informed environment, because babies like black and white. They like high contrast stimuli. So psychologically informed environment would be one way we would try, at least as best we can, to organize some of our protocols, procedures, ways of operating around an understanding of the psychological needs of the people that we're working with. And that becomes very, very important for those who, as I say, understandably and through no fault of their own, have significant anxieties and difficulties in the care relationship. I'm just going to give this one example, and then we'll proceed to the end. This is one of my bugbears. We talk about a lot this in healthcare. This person really isn't engaging. Interestingly, often at that point, there's 6 people sitting around a table talking about how this person is not engaging, which always makes me think, when's the last time 6 people sat around a table talking about me? Because I think the person is engaging. What they may be engaging is in a way that we don't want them to engage, or not in a way that we set the service up for people to engage. So up in the top right hand corner, we have nice healthy engagement. We like this. Someone turned up for their appointment. Look, they're talking about their mother, filling in thought diaries, and doing healthcare properly, like they're relating to it in the ways in which we designed it. But here's Bob down in the bottom left hand corner, and he's engaging with the appointment I had with him by not turning up. But he's still engaging because I'm thinking about him. I'm thinking, where's Bob? We were meant to meet, and he's not here. And maybe the not turning upness is trying to show me something about disappointment, or maybe he's communicating abandonment to me, or letting me know what it's like to be left, or to be forgotten about, or to be ignored, or to be mistreated in some other way. Maybe there's quite a powerful communication in the not turning upness. Or maybe he's just showing me that he's too anxious to come along to the clinic because it has shut doors and corridors and secret rooms and people who might ask him about himself. And that's a bit much, even though part of him really does want some help. So we might spend some time thinking about how people engage and what that might tell us about their particular life predicament, rather than constantly imposing our own particular view of what engagement is and using that as a way of measuring other people's relationships, and then excluding them if they don't relate or engage in the ways in which we've developed and organized the service. I'm going to skip through that because it'll take too long. It's good, but I'm going to come back to it. So really this is the end, really. And I just wanted to touch on a couple of processes. Here's a quote that I said not that long ago. You can see I've basically stolen it from Winnicott, but cleverly changed one word. Haha, clever me. There's no such thing as a patient. And I suppose really what I mean by that is, as soon as they were using the word patient, then you are talking about someone else. You're talking about someone who calls somebody a patient. And then at that point, you are talking about a relationship. And even though it might be invisible, and it might not even be the thing that we've set the clinic up for, or what we think we're doing, it is always a fundamental and essential part of the care that we try and provide. And even though it's invisible, there are times when we feel it acutely, and over time there are times when we can feel it chronically. It can be very, very hard emotional work for us to stay in relation to people who bring unwittingly histories of traumatic care, abusive care, neglectful care, that we might find ourselves involved in those sorts of care dynamics in a way that is difficult, emotionally difficult and psychologically difficult. One way of trying to pay attention to that is processes like having reflective practice groups, regular case consultations, supervision groups. Basically, you can call them what you like, but places where we can sit and think about what it's like to be in the relationships that we are in, for 2 purposes. Well, for many, but 2 at least. One, for our own health and well-being, so we can legitimately have a safe space where we can talk about how frustrated we are, how annoyed or how defeated we feel, or how pissed off we feel, such that it doesn't get enacted back towards the person. and two, to try and reflect on some of the dynamics we're involved in, to see if they can shed any light or inform about how we can try and stay in relation to the person and organize ourselves differently in a way that might try and address the psychological and emotional and relational needs of the person coming to look for help. This is the final slide, which is, anyone know where that is? That's right, that's the psychology services. They're in a little tower hidden in a valley miles away and very, very hard to access. And so I think one of the things we could do, certainly from a mental health point of view, is rather than position ourselves in secondary care all the time, providing specialist treatment for individuals, that we might do better to actually support the wide range of staff, you know, in primary care, in the community, who do the vast, vast majority of mental health work. It's just not called that. But by virtue of being in relation to people and sticking with them and, you know, trying to work through all the breaks and challenges within that relationship, that is the mental health work. And as I say, we might do well at times to support the people who are actually doing it, rather than hold on to some idea that you need to be some super high wizard of something to do that sort of work. That's the end, really. Just one note about the cartoon. I think the cartoon, I put it up because it's quite funny, but also just to remind ourselves that a lot of the time, we spend a lot of time thinking about patients, maybe 99.9% of our time thinking about patients, and the rest of the time just bunking off, and often don't spend a huge amount of time thinking about our own parts in these relationships, both individually and in terms of how services are set up. And I think it's a very important thing to do. One, for patient care, such that we don't, as I say, end up reenacting some of the very relationships that brought people looking for care in the first place. And two, for our own well-being, because to be in such relationships, and if we want to try and stay in those relationships, then we need to pay close attention and, as I say, shine a light on the emotional and psychological impacts it can have for us to work in areas of psychological and relational trauma. I'm going to stop there. I'll stop sharing. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. That was just incredibly thought-provoking, and probably the most brilliantly accessible way of explaining internal worlds that I've ever seen. So yeah, that was an absolute joy to listen to. Thank you. So we're going to turn now to our first keynote listener, who's going to bring a different perspective on this theme of relationships and healthcare, Elizabeth Kelly. Elizabeth is a GP by background, and for the last 3 years, she's been providing support and leadership for the Carnegie UK Trust's work promoting kindness in health and social care. She currently chairs the Scottish Government Oversight Group for the Wellbeing and Mental Health Network for the health and social care workforce as well. So Elizabeth, a very, very warm welcome, and I'll hand over to you now.
Many thanks, Sarah, and thank you, Adam. I just, again, like Sarah, found that really thought-provoking, and welcome to all of you that are here today. And I hung up my stethoscope a year ago, and part of my work with Carnegie has really enabled me to think about and reflect on 35, 40 years in the health service, and particularly working as a general practitioner, often in rural areas. The slide, Carnegie has done a lot of work around about kindness, and I'm going to use that sort of lens to just build on what Adam said, using kindness as a way of discussions that start getting really real about actually how I am, what the impact of kindness has in a positive way and also in a deficits way when we see unkindness. And I would absolutely echo that the quality of care is fundamentally impacted on how we are, not perhaps about what we are or what we do and all the technical skills that we have accumulated, but fundamentally on how we are. That if we are well, I believe we're more open to listening, or perhaps I am more open to listening. And about building trust. If you think about what Adam was saying, for me, a lot of it was around about the building of trust in relationships. And when you work in the community, it's one of the great things for me was about being able to build that trust over time. And I think that's a huge asset for those of you working in the community that often those working in hospitals don't have. What we do is we recognise the stories that we hear and we hold. And the impact of them on the people in the context of their own lives, their amazing assets and their resilience, as well as the dysfunction that periods of being less well can cause. And obviously, as many of you are involved in people as they become more frail, become more dependent, and ultimately end their lives. But also there's something about us, about actually what does being well mean for me as a person, let alone me as a doctor or a mother, a wife, sister. And I kind of really was reflecting on what Adam said about those early relationships you have within your family. I had a really lovely upbringing, but it was about being a good girl and you were being not causing trouble or lots of love, lots of affirmation, but just keeping going. And there's a lovely slide that I'm sure many of you have seen of a healthcare worker going into a room with a person lying in a bed with a suit of armour on. And some of the stories I'll tell just now are around about my armour that just almost got thicker and thicker before it fragmented. And it was really as in my last 4 or 5 years in practice that I was felt safe enough to be vulnerable. And I wonder how many of you and us are comfortable expressing that vulnerability to others round about us, because that for me is about actually being kind to ourselves. We all work and hear stories that are really tough ones, and taking time to think about actually what it is that I need to do to look after myself in the busyness of life. I must admit I've not always found easy, but I think as we talk more about well-being and mental health, something about thinking about and actually taking time out in this conference is something for you to be able to think about. Touching on relational kindness is about not only the kindness and the openness to others that we see as our healthcare professionals, but actually to each other in our teams. We kind of come into work in the morning and actually, are you looking forward to coming and meeting your colleagues? Is there a cup of coffee on the go? Is there a bit of banter about what actually happened with the kids last night, or kind of what you failed to cook or what you did cook? Little bit of a story. I worked in a lovely rural practice, and my mum was dying, and I had built up relationships over a number of years with my colleagues, and they knew mum wasn't great, and my armour was getting quite thicker, and I was just trying to enable mum to be as well as possible. She was living in a supported environment, and then actually was admitted into the local community hospital. And the practice manager drove past me. I was on a way to a branch surgery, and one morning she just drove past me. I didn't see her, just kind of gave her a nod, and off I went and did the surgery. You can hear my emotion in it, but by the time I got back at lunchtime, she had spoken to my colleagues, she'd spoken to the local health board. The locums were in place for 2 o'clock that afternoon. And I went and spent the last 3 or 4 days with my mum before she died. And that for me was just extraordinary. Somebody had noticed my needs, my sadness, and had taken the responsibility for me asking for help, which I found quite difficult to do something very constructive and immensely kind. When you work in communities, you work with all sorts of different people. And as we come together, we bring a whole lot of different experiences and skills. And I remember a patient who had motor neuron disease in the community. We hadn't seen very many people with MND. There's a wonderful MND nursing service, and maybe some people who are on the call with that sort of experience. And because we lived 2 or 3 hours away from the centre, Peter was able to talk to us about his fear of those journeys, going up to see the specialists. And by building up relationships, both with the specialist and within ourselves, my community nurses that I worked with, kind of Macmillan nurse, social care resources and people, he was able to say, can we not do more at home? And that relationship enabled us to, the motor neuron nurse came down and had a session with us over an afternoon. We had regular palliative care meetings of which Peter's voice was heard. And although his death, as many people with MND, happened more quickly than when he expected to, he spent those last few weeks in a fantastic seat with his devices that would enable him to communicate, listening to the bird song that he loved, and being at home in an environment, and knowing that his fear about having 2 or 3 hours in a car, or let alone in the back of an ambulance, were not going to happen. And I don't think we could have done that without the kindness, the relationships that we had built up. Not about the skills that we brought to it, although that was important, but actually about how we were and the trust we had in each other and the learning that we did, and the time of reflection of actually what it meant when he died, because we had all known him as a person before he became somebody who worked with us as a patient. And I would absolutely agree with Adam about the use of patient rather than person. Person is actually who we are and who we work with. My brother, I've got 2 very much older brothers, as I keep teasing them. And when I had newly qualified and I seemed to be accumulating a number of different letters after my name, he brought me down to earth and wrote to me as Dr. Elizabeth Forbes, as I was there, ABCDE ... And I've never forgotten that. Yes, I can put lots of letters after my name, but actually, so what? It's so much about who I am. And that takes me towards the end of my reflections. In terms of some of the leadership roles, I chaired a health board. As you heard from Sarah, I chair a group around about mental health and well-being at the moment. In that space in leadership, and for many of you that have got leadership roles, they may not be defined leadership roles, but actually for many of you, you are leading teams, you are a key part of your team. You certainly have got a leadership role in terms of the people you are working with in the community. It is about that listening and enabling, and recognizing that there are pressures that will come from the organisation that actually you have to manage as you try to enable people to be well, to deliver care, but also kind of that tension between the two. Before COVID, there was a huge amount of recognition of the stress and the difficult relationships that existed within the health service and the health and social care service. They've been probably seen through a different lens through COVID. And as we come out of COVID, there is more and more angst that I think about what the next few months, years are going to deliver. And although there are many resources now available to us all about well-being and mental health, whether through well-being resources on the hub or through the workforce specialist service, local opportunities, that all takes time. And I would encourage you in your roles and looking towards leaders within your organisation, how do you get the time to reflect on how you are, reflect on the experiences you see on a day-to-day basis and how they touch you. And for me, part of leadership is not just seeing the numbers of sickness absence related to stress and anxiety, but actually just putting in breaks for people to take time to do that reflective practice, to take time to say, actually, I need a couple of days. It's difficult when you feel that actually people won't get the care if you're absent, but perhaps presenteeism is as damaging as absenteeism. And lastly, and there's a slide that I just like to put up, is around about kindness in organizations. The two lexicons that were written about in Carnegie, and Julia Unwin wrote a lovely piece around about relationships and kindness in public policy, the blind spot, and you can access it through the Carnegie website. But she talked about the rational and the relational. And my concern still is that in terms of health and social care, we have drifted towards the rational lexicon, both in terms of our own experiences and the work in the teams and the areas that we work in, but also in terms of government and particularly in the political and media environment. Yes, it should be, of course, it should be balanced, fair, safe and transparent. We use a huge amount of public money. And so, yes, there needs to be scrutiny and value for money. There needs to be targets and accountability. But the risk is, as it becomes arid, it becomes detached and it becomes declining trust. And it becomes perhaps all about the systems, processes, inputs. And although all of that is important, what I would ask is you think about actually, is there some balance between that rational and the relational lexicon where you work? And if there is, which is about connection, individuality, hope and personal change, all about well-being, friendship, relationships, warmth. The risk is that it's more of a populist response, maybe favoritism, but actually the outcomes are about relationships, trust, and ability to challenge with kindness, dignity, and respect when things are perhaps unkind or unhelpful for what you're trying to achieve. Munira Ahmed spoke yesterday, and she's been tweeting recently. Munira, if you haven't followed her, she is a prolific tweeter, is that all the data in the world doesn't paint a picture. It is that combination of the data and the story that create the picture and the care that we want to. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was really moving, actually. Really struck by how powerful it is when you're open about your experience of being a health professional. So thank you for that. I'm now going to introduce our second keynote listener, Austyn Snowden. Austyn is Professor in Mental Health and Head of Nursing at Edinburgh Napier University. He's lead researcher for the European Research Institute for Healthcare Chaplaincy, and he's lead author of more than 80 peer-reviewed papers, 10 book chapters, and 3 books on a wide range of topics. His academic interests are incredibly broad-ranging and include methodology, psychometrics, spirituality, cancer care, complex interventions in community care, and the relationship between physical and mental health. So Austyn, it's brilliant to have you with us this morning, and I'm delighted to invite you to give your keynote response now.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Was that introduction about me? Who wrote that? Sounds incredible. What a guy. I hope you can all hear me okay. My internet's just told me I'm unstable. But I'd like to, I suppose, start by going through some things that Adam said in particular, and linking them to what Liz said at the end, and hopefully bringing it all together by suggesting that perhaps chaplains are the answer to all of our problems. So I've given you the end there already. But shining a light on the invisible, I think it depends on who's holding the torch. And by that, I'm going to go through the chapters, and I'll share my screen so that you can see what I'm talking about at the same time. I hope you can see that now. Won't be a sec. No, I've only got 10 minutes from current slide. So this is what I'm talking about. When I was listening to Adam, I was thinking, you know, he was talking about care being relational, and that reminded me of lots of songs, Simon and Garfunkel in particular. But it also put me in mind when he was talking about Calvin and Hobbes, thinking of each other, being there in both their physical and psychic presence, reminded me of quadrihermeneutics, which I'm sure it did you. It's a function of constructionism, one of the philosophical methodologies used when trying to understand the relationships between people. And it struck me that this is also all about consciousness, isn't it? It's about a theory of mind. And that put me in mind of Susan Blackmore and her journey to discover what had happened to her when she left her own body. So I think a lot about these things, as you can probably tell. She's spent her entire lifetime trying to figure out what had happened to her because the experience was so incredibly real. And after about 50 years of looking, she's come to realize that it was just in her brain. It was, you know, you can actually prod certain areas of the brain and create these sensations that she had of leaving her body. I'm just putting that out there. I don't hold any great store on it because other people look at consciousness in a completely different way. But the idea that, you know, you go around on a minute-to-minute basis without realizing what you're doing is the point that Adam was making, I think. And Susan Blackmore often asks herself, if you want to think about consciousness in any sort of serious way, ask yourself if you're conscious now, and try to set a reminder for asking yourself that on a regular basis. And I'll think you'll find that you're not thinking about yourself every time. I just wanted to add, because I thought that Liz, in her story of her origin there, mentioned about being a good girl as a kind of, I sensed a sense of sadness there. And I don't think there's any sadness in that at all. If I've missed that, Liz, please forgive me. I think growing up in a loving family is absolutely great. And that leads me on to the second point, which Adam really made me think about. A couple of things I've never thought of before. The fact that, you know, our institutions were built by people who were well and rational, essentially middle class. Well, obviously that's going to be a hostile environment to anybody who's unwell. And therefore to need the services of the hospital is to be irrational to start with. So there's a real schism there, isn't there? And that put me in mind of all the double bind theories and the way that, you know, people grow as a function of trauma. That also led me to think, you know, that given that trauma is so topical at the moment, there's been a real interesting shift. And I've just watched this series on Netflix, where instead of, you know, the baddie being a joker or someone who's had a really traumatic upbringing, the perpetrator actually just did it because they were bored. And I think that's kind of a function of our post-truth world now. There's no explanations for things anymore. You know, we're not looking for psychiatric explanations, you know, for a lot of behavior. It just happens. And so I wonder if there's actually a return to some really quite behavioristic theory. And I'm happy to talk about that in more detail, but I know I've only got 10 minutes. The three fish in a tree, I just love those fish in a tree. How can they be? I think Dr. Seuss is one of the wisest authors ever. But the surfing story also put me in mind of one of Hanlon's papers on public health. And he sees public health as a function of different waves. So starting with the first wave of, you know, asylums in 1800 and public health, then germ theory comes along, and then the war brings in the NHS along with it. And he thinks we're currently on the fourth wave. I think we're about to enter the fifth and the sixth, given that the fourth wave and the fifth wave are all about quality and community care, moving care to focus more on the individual. But actually an awful lot's happened in the last couple of years, and we're entering sort of a post-truth phase. And so I think, you know, it's quite fascinating, really, that I'll show you in a sec, because Liz highlighted it really nicely. What she's talking about is sixth wave thinking. So I'll just come back to that at the end. I also think that trust being essential to all of these relationship issues, I thought of that as a sort of post-truth palliative. And I mean, no harm in that, but it is, isn't it? I think we need to be able to trust each other in a world where truth doesn't mean anything anymore. Finally, moving on to the doctor's stethoscope bit, the parent professional and not needing your suit of armor anymore. I thought that was fabulous. You know, because once you strip all of this away, what you're left with is the solution, which is the individual standing in front of the person needing help. And so this is what Liz put up. Sorry, Liz, I just took a snapshot of you there at the time. And these different lexicons, I think, are just fascinating, really, especially down at the bottom here, in that, you know, the outcome, instead of being, in other words, the outcome is what we would have thought of previously as a process. In other words, a relationship is a means to an end. Trust is a means to an end, and challenge is a means to an end. Whereas it's wonderful to see these as outcomes in themselves. I've been arguing for this for years, and it's brilliant to see that there. Whereas the rational element is all about, you know, the systems that underpin that, the processes, the professionalism, the skills, the competencies, everything like that. It's wonderful to see, you know, these elements as outcomes in themselves. And just to come back to that sixth wave, this is the Nursing 2030 strategy. And the bottom one here is a wonderful example of the bottom there of these lexicons here, of what is expected of our current health professionals. We're supposed to have in place systems of assurance that ensure consistency of standards across Scotland without losing the essence of compassionate, personalised, rights-based care. Okay, I think that's asking an awful lot of people. And what I've heard this morning from both Liz and Adam as really experienced clinicians is that to get to that point where you can hold those in tension comfortably without your suit of armor takes tremendous experience, skill, and I just wonder if it's asking quite a lot of our younger generation. But I think perhaps our leaders, and I do agree with Liz on this, need to lead and show that it is actually possible. I'm also Austyn Snowden, ABCDE. At home, I muck out the horses, and I'm extremely way down the list. And I think there's an importance in humility. Just as a last point, I also think, you know, that having breaks is really, really important. And I've just been on the most wonderful holiday where my wife surprised me every day with another member of the family turning up to say hello, some of whom I hadn't seen for 18 months. And it was just wonderful. So I'd like to publicly thank my wife here at the moment. And also say that, you know, you can, it's the simple things, isn't it? It's just valuing people and being able to hear them and do small things, which is really, really kind of important. And just back to the chaplains to finish, is I think it's possibly easier for chaplains to treat people as people instead of patients than it is for any other health profession. And the reason I think that is because they don't have an agenda, whereas, you know, the GP has to prescribe and fix, nurse has to care plan and take care of someone and observe them, a physio has to stretch them, an occupational therapist, you know, has to create a care plan, so on and so forth. There's always an agenda, whereas I think chaplains are in a particularly privileged position to be able to just hear the person. And so I'd like to see chaplaincy used a lot more. So that's my plug for healthcare chaplains, and that's my response to Adam and Liz. I'll stop sharing now. Did I go too quickly?
Well, that was perfect, Austyn. Thank you so much. Yeah, really thought-provoking and challenging as well in helping us to recognise, well, firstly, the different perspectives there are to bring on this, and secondly, how difficult this is actually, that it's not about just saying that relationships are important and believing that they're important, but that there are genuine challenges with this. So that was really helpful. So now that we've heard from all three speakers, we're going to move in just briefly into shared dialogue and then also some questions that have been raised. And I probably like to go first to you, Adam, just to give you the chance to come back in response to both Liz and Austyn. So I'll give you a few minutes just to do that.
Well, I maybe won't take a few minutes. I was just typing in there in the chat, I was just saying thanks, Austyn. It's lovely to see someone take what I say so seriously to actually make notes. I'm really touched by that. I think what Liz was saying around, it's interesting, it's sort of doing a talk like that, and I'm aware that I was rushing through something which I would probably usually take longer with, and finding that words like trust and safety, I'm not sure I even said them, you know, and certainly kindness. But I think they're really, really, really key components. I think one of the things that when you really sort of try and shine a light on this stuff, to say, you know, what is one of the fundamental sort of rate determining steps in terms of accessing healthcare from a psychological perspective? Well, trust. And while we put in sort of wheelchair ramps and parking bays for people who have very visible physical needs in terms of accessing healthcare, I've yet to see anything that really pays attention to the sort of very real psychological relational needs that people might have in areas like trust, safety, that, as I say, they had no choice over developing, and through their own history of learning that to be in relation to a carer was a very, very, very dangerous thing to do, like the craziest thing to do. And to come and ask for help now is madness. You know, I think one of the ironies of something like personality disorder as a term is, no, the disorder would be the person coming along and being able to make use of healthcare in a really straightforward way. That would be really disordered, given the history that they've had. That would be madness. So I don't know. I think, as you can see, my thoughts are just sort of swirling around, really, nothing massively coherent. But I suppose I've been thinking a lot recently around access issues, access to healthcare, access to services, and how blind at times we are. As I say, I don't think out of any malice, but how blind we are at times to the sort of relational requirements that we actually put in place and assume that people have to be able to come along and sort of make use of care. And I thank Liz for bringing up trust and safety, which I think I missed, and kindness. And for Austyn's beautifully insightful and lovely reflections on what I'd said. Yeah.
Thanks, Adam. I'm gonna. We've got quite a few questions that have come up in the chat, so I'm going to kind of combine the questions with the dialogue and just keep it a little bit fluid for the next 10 minutes. And the first question I'm going to go with, Liz, I'll come to you first, and then Austyn, and then Adam, if there's anything else. It's from Derek Barron, and it's saying that taking account that a person's trauma and history and current context might be why they don't turn up at an appointment, how would you think about redesigning healthcare to encourage somebody to be able to use it or to be able to engage?
Goodness, that's not exactly an easy question for a Thursday morning, and I think it's one that we will grapple with for years, and I think kind of this morning's really kind of unpick some of the real complexities and issues. So the one of the things I think I would start with is having trying to influence a very different dialogue that we have at the moment around about what success and failure looks like in terms of our health service. And I will say the health service rather than health and social care. The matrix seemed to be around about binary access, 4-hour waits in accident emergency, 12-week waits for waiting times. And that puts immense pressure from the data being published on a Tuesday to First Minister's questions on a Thursday to the media having some slant play on it. And I feel that until we have a much more open and realistic conversation that I think needs us all to be part of in Scotland, and it certainly needs a cross-party agreement around about what a dialogue around about the future of the health service means, that I think we're into real difficulties about trying to recognise the time that it will take to really allow those trusting relationships to develop for people to feel that they can take that first step into being vulnerable. And for the people that I've engaged with who really struggle with even phoning for an appointment or even using an online system, even walking in through a door, I think the benefit that I have seen both in working in a rural environment where people know each other a bit better. The reception staff of a GP practice are fundamental to picking up nuances of when someone's struggling. So in my experience, actually having those relationships in a community and having somebody who said, young lad was on the phone today, he didn't sound great, and then he put the phone down. Having the guts in some respects to come and knock on the door and say, I'm a bit worried about that, and allowing me to do something or having a different approach was absolutely invaluable. And I suppose it's saying that, have we built in systems and processes that are far too complex? I mean, if you think about actually what it's like to try and negotiate the health service when you are feeling unwell, and I don't know, I've certainly had to do that in this year, and it's been a really difficult environment, even though I know how it works, that I think we've got a very honest conversation about actually doing something differently. But actually we do need politicians, government and media to give permission to have a different conversation underpinned by kindness, trust and respect and dignity.
Brilliant, thanks Liz. Can I come to you, Austyn, for your response?
And what a Derek Barron question that was as well. Thanks, Derek. Hello. I'm going to take an optimistic perspective on this, if that's all right, because when I was a community nurse, that's who I used to go and see. So hopefully there are still mental health nurses out there working in the community who would identify and help some of these vulnerable people as a practical, and it's not, and that idea has also been articulated by health and social care partners as well. I've just finished a 5-year evaluation of improving cancer journeys in Glasgow, led by Glasgow City Council in partnership with Macmillan and Greater Glasgow NHS and 220 other partners, and people newly diagnosed with cancer were sent an invite to the service. So that was like a proactive invitation for help. And the evaluation that we've just completed showed that it was extremely successful, and that the people who took up the invitation were those in the most need, those who were the most in the lowest deprivation categories, with non-health needs like money and housing and transport, although obviously pain and fatigue and other issues arose. And the Scottish Government have funded the rollout of that to other health authorities and local authorities. And so I think there is an appetite there for improved transformative services. The language is changing. And I'd like to think, you know, that with genuine examples of operational success like ICJ, and I have nothing to do with ICJ, they finished paying me. I'm not saying this, you know, I declare an interest because I think it's a genuinely wonderful way of working. We've been trying to work with this seamless service since I certainly joined, and no doubt before. And I'm talking about, you know, the 80s. And it's been really difficult because of these silo financial pots, and it's ludicrous. And this was a way of doing it that actually worked. So now we have models like that. I think they can be rolled out. And I think and the evidence is that they do actually help those who may not necessarily find picking up a phone to the GP or traditional health services easy to access. We have ways of doing this.
Yeah, that's great. Really helpful to have some of those specific examples as well. Thanks, Austyn. Adam, I might come to you next for your response to this question.
I'll be brief just to pick up on what's been said. I was talking about this the other day. I think it's interesting, you know, when you, for example, registering with the GP for the first time, with primary care for the first time, we might ask all sorts of issues around access. But I don't know that we routinely say, what do you like at relating to healthcare? Like we might actually screen for it. And even if the person doesn't give a response, we might still ask, what have your experiences of care been like? What your early experience of care been like? What's it going to be like you coming in or picking up the phone and having multiple options to wade through and sit on the phone, or come and speak to us? What's it going to be like for you in terms of access? We wouldn't ask as many questions like that, or as heated as I've just described it, but we might ask something like that. And even if the person isn't able to answer that, we might pick up after the fact that they've missed 3 or 4 appointments, that there may be something going on in the relationship that they have with care, and we might try and offer provision. It might even just be, for example, a dedicated phone line for people who we have identified and know have a significant anxiety about seeking healthcare, to the point where that is their core health ailment, because all the other stuff can be treated. But of course, if they don't get there, then it has nothing. And of course, people say, well, everybody wants a phone where they can, yeah, but everybody might want a ramp to the door, and everybody might want a car parking space by the front door, but not everybody gets it. We provide it for people who have, you know, genuine need. And I think it's trying to find ways of recognizing and providing for people where just because it's invisible doesn't mean that an anxiety about seeking healthcare is not massively real and massively life limiting. So, you know, something like dedicated phone line, asking people at the beginning, you know, and being curious throughout what their relationship with care is like. Simple things like, you know, not discharging people after 3 missed appointments, particularly in secondary care, if they've gone through long periods of actually managing to get to the GP, get a referral to trauma services, and then miss 3 appointments. And maybe having some process whereby we could reflect on what the missing of the appointment might mean and see if we can offer something else to the person. Even to write to them and say, we noticed you've missed appointments and we were wondering what that's about, rather than, we've noticed you've missed 3 appointments, so we've discharged you back to the GP. So I think those sorts of things really, and again, you know, as Austyn and Liz were talking about, trying to find mutually comfortable spaces, particularly for those first meetings. You know, I think again, at times, I think we're a bit blind to the idea that coming to a strange clinic with, you know, doors and waiting rooms and stuff can be, you know, can just be a hurdle too far for people who are looking for help, but have very understandable anxieties about, you know, seeking that help.
I think, can I just come in? I think that just, I was thinking about your the letters, you know, 3 strikes and you're out. You know, there are some, you know, I wonder whether people, I did towards the end of my general practice career, I did locums in various different practices, and there were often notices up in the waiting room that how many people missed their appointment in the last month, thinking, you know, we're just adding, you know, we're putting our own lens on our frustrations rather than actually saying, you know, yeah. Anyway, yeah, it was just a noticing that as you were speaking, I was thinking about those posters of the number of people who hadn't turned up for their appointment.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. We have a number of questions that we've not managed to get to, and we will try to answer those After the session, we're also planning to put together a very brief flash report summary of the session. So we'll include some of the questions in that, particularly the ones we've not managed to answer, maybe with some written answers, and everyone will get a copy of that. So thank you for those, and apologies if we didn't manage to get to your question. So I really want to thank Adam, Elizabeth and Austyn for joining us this morning and for together creating a really thought-provoking and enlightening session. We really appreciate your energy and your expertise. It's been fantastic. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And it's time now for me to give the stage to our resident poet for this session, Stuart Patterson. Stuart is an acclaimed award-winning poet and performer of his work in English and in Scots. He's raised and educated in Kilmarnock, Ayrshire, and he's held many writing residences and has extensive experience of working in the areas of family outreach, housing and homeless support, and residential childcare. Stuart was BBC Scotland's Poet in Residence in 2017 to 18, and he also collaborated with us at QNIS earlier this year. So we're pleased and excited to hear his poetry, written today in direct response to this session and recited by him now. So Stuart, the screen and the floor are most definitely all yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and hello everybody who's tuning in, all the nurses, all the professionals, all the people who don't write poetry. That'll be me, although some of you might, I don't know. This has been a really, really interesting, well, it's an absolute delight to be invited again to be involved with the community nurses and the QNIS. It's been absolutely fantastic and a learning process for me as well. Anything that I write, I have to say, I base on my own experience of life, social care, and it was a profession for me for years and years. I did work in social care, health and social care, children's homes, family intervention, worked with loads of kids, and worked with loads of young people, basically, yeah, who went through and suffered a lot of the very things I'm hearing about today and people speaking about, and especially what Adam was saying, is, yeah, it's saying things to me that I wish I'd heard back then as a carer for young people. And so, although I knew about this, expressing it and putting it into words could be difficult. So hearing what's being said today has been as helpful to me as anything, not just creatively, but personally, and I agree with so much of it. I've been asked to come along and write a poem based on what I've been hearing this morning, and it's so deep that I think I could probably spend a fair bit of time just writing an entire book about it, to be honest with you, not just what's been said by the people here, the speakers, which has been brilliant, but also on, you know, listening to and remembering my own experiences of working with people who have been through this, who have indeed had lots and lots of invisible trauma and disabilities and problems, and a lot of people dealing with them, not actually putting on the correct lenses to see that. So I have written a poem based on you know, what I've heard this morning. I'd like to read it. It's not very often. I think the last time I did it was on BBC Scotland on the Kay Burley show. So, you know, I was Kay Adams, sorry, not Kay Burley, Kay Adams, on a news show where I was asked to write a poem during the programme about what I was hearing, but that was about the headlines for the day. This has been much more interesting, much more deep, and correct as well. It's been absolutely fabulous. So I'd like to read you out a poem that I've been writing while I've been listening to it. And the subject matter is interesting: fairer, kinder, greener. And so that's kind of like, and also hearing what people have been saying has led me on to write so far this poem, which I'd imagine might get longer. I'd like to share the screen just now, but I think I won't. Because the poem I'll finish off and add up to and tidy off and put in my spelling errors, well, correct them on autocorrect, and then it'll be available for people to read after this. So it doesn't actually have a title yet. Like a lot of people that we speak to and work with don't have titles, but this is the poem that I've written, listening to what everybody's been saying. Never be carer who's blinder and meaner. Be someone fairer, kinder, greener. Babies love faces and love black and white. Love being in spaces where all they love is right. There's no such thing as a patient. Everything and everyone's relationed. Patients are people, and people patients. Training, explaining, qualifications and letters after names need not add up to breathing breaths of help and patience. No such thing as a baby, just an us that never lives for maybe. Those who can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Traumatic, abusive dynamics need to help us help them, not meet it. Letters after names are not as important as what and who you are. An alphabet of self that ought to spell correctly C-A-R-E-H-E-A-L-T-H, care, health. Targets, accountability and process need to be fuller of care and yeses. Never be carer who's blinder and greener. Be someone fairer, kinder, greener. Thank you. And I'd like to thank you all for listening and for, I've been reading some of the comments as well in the chat that has been really, really interesting. And as I said, the whole thing to me has been a learning process today. It's been full of stuff which I will now, I think, bring into my own work. And it's been really, really opening, because I think the QNIS and community nurses in Scotland are an absolutely amazing organisation and group of people. And speaking to so many of them earlier in the year, for being really proud to be asked to come along and do a lecture. I read any symposiums because I'm a working class person. I come from Ayrshire originally, and I live in Galloway, and I work in a lot of skills, and I work in a lot of organisations, and I work with lots of people who have disabilities and who have indeed, gotten visibility within them. And I still work with people like that because I've worked with them professionally, and working with them personally is a real, real honour to me. And I do tend to write about the kind of things that I work in, the kind of situations I work in, and the people that I work with. And to me, that really is a privilege. So it's a privilege also to come along and be asked along today, not just to actually listen, but to take part and respond to it creatively. And it's been absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much.